Welcome back, everyone. So I'd like to share a little bit today about the Dhammacakkapavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel, the Sutta of the turning of the wheel. But before I do that, I'll go ahead and pay homage to the Triple Gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. Here we are. It is the fourth Saturday in July, and that means that a couple of weeks ago, a little bit more than a couple of weeks ago, we had uh, the some ceremonies marking the beginning of Vasa. It's known as Vasa in the Theravada tradition, the rains retreat, and goes from the full moon of July, which in this year was on July 4th. From the day after the full moon, actually, until the full moon of October. And historically, it was a time when the Buddha asked the monastics to shelter in place. It's the time of the monsoons in India, and the folks were concerned that if the monastics were wandering and teaching as they normally did, that they would be crushing small grasses and creatures that would come out of the ground because of the water, because of the rain. And so they were told to stay in one place for this period of time. And it became a time where they could intensify their practice, they could nourish their practice so that then the rest of the year they could go out and share the teachings. And so I chose the Dhammacakkapavattana Sutta, the Sutta of the turning of the wheel, the discourse of the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, because that's the one that usually is celebrated, is discussed, explored, chanted at the beginning of the rains retreat. And so it's seasonal, so to speak, and it's also a celebratory sutta. And I think that given things that are going on in the world right now, we really need some good news. We need some reason to celebrate. So I'm going to talk about this sutta. And again, for those of you who may have downloaded this, our chant book online, you will find this on page 49 of our chant book, the Dhammacakkapavattana Sutta, or the English version begins on page 49. And not to worry if you haven't done that, because I'll be reading the relevant parts as I go along this evening. So the discourse on setting in motion the wheel of Dhamma, this is understood to be the Buddha's first teaching after his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. He had some period of weeks there in bliss after his enlightenment, and then he decided that he wanted to go and try to share what he had discovered with the 5 ascetics with whom he had been practicing before his enlightenment, with his 5 companions on the spiritual path. And these 5 folks, these 5 men with whom he'd been practicing, had basically decided not to practice with him at the point at which the Buddha decided that he would take some food from Sujata, the laywoman who offered him some rice gruel. The Buddha decided that he needed to follow a path that had more joy, actually, and that fasting to the point of near death or death would actually not resolve his problem, which was to come to the resolution of God. So this is his first discourse after his awakening. And the beginning of the discourse, it says, he was staying at the deer sanctuary at Isipatana near Benares. And we often sort of skip over this part about where the Buddha was and go directly to what the teaching is. But I want to highlight this because I think it has a couple of meanings. One meaning is, I imagine that it was a sort of memory aid for Venerable Ananda, who is said to have recited these teachings for them to be shared over and over again after the Buddha's death. But also that it's a reminder to us of the Buddha as a human being, as an Indian man who walked the earth, who was actually not a god, not a deity, but a person who made this incredibly transcendent discovery. And he begins by saying to these 5 seekers, he says, these 2 extremes should not be followed. The extreme of sensual indulgence and the extreme of self, we call it self-torture is the particular translation that's here in our text. I would say like mortification, self-mortification, or mortification of the body and the mind. These 2 extremes are unprofitable, he says, ignoble, vulgar, coarse, unprofitable, meaning that they're not helpful. And it seems, in retrospect, to be an obvious place to start, because these folks would have known that the Buddha was born into a situation of a family of wealth and power. And so before becoming a seeker, he certainly had every opportunity to pursue a life that was all about the next pleasure, the next sensual pleasure. And he found that deeply unsatisfying. And on the other hand, then he also went through a process of this kind of extremely harsh asceticism, of holding the breath until his head was bursting with pain, of, he said, crushing the mind with mind, or, as I mentioned a moment ago, fasting to such an extreme that he was very near death. So he tried also these kind of very extremely harsh measures, and he came to the conclusion that neither one of these 2 is the path to the end of suffering. And so we ourselves can experience this as well. Living a life which goes of a constant seeking of pleasures is basically a never-ending task, a never satisfied life. And certainly suffering, bringing more pain and mortification to the body and the mind doesn't seem like a good way to get to the end of suffering either. So he says, no, there's a middle way. There's a middle way, and the middle way is one that leads to calm and vision and understanding and enlightenment, to nibbana. And there is a path. He says the middle way is realized by the Tathagata, by himself, was realized by this path of the Noble Eightfold Path. And he lists the path there for us: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. And then he goes directly into a teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So this is his beginning with right view. This is his way of teaching his fellow companions about right view, right from the start. So he's not only describing the path as it worked for him, but he is giving them the opportunity to see how this could also unfold for them. And so right view is typically described as having two aspects, or oftentimes it's taught that way. One is a basic understanding in the efficacy of action. You can't even really begin to take up the practice unless you understand that what you do matters, that the choices you make about what you say, about what you think, about what you do with your body, these things all have effects, they have consequences. And that aspect of right view is implicit here, and we'll see the Buddha refer to it over and over again in the rest of this discourse. But I want to say he doesn't specifically say that at this particular junction. It's implicit, though, in the way that he goes on to describe the Four Noble Truths. And so the Four Noble Truths are the primary way that we know about right view. And the first truth is the truth of dukkha, the noble truth of dukkha. So you might say to yourself, wait, I thought this was going to be an upbeat, celebratory sutta. And it is. But the Buddha begins there with dukkha. So dukkha, and he says very specifically in here, dukkha is grief, sorrow, despair, old age, sickness, death. So being together with things that you, or people, or places that you dislike, being away from things that you, or people, or places that you like, not getting what you want, or this kind of clinging to the sense of identity through body and mind. He talks about all of these sort of the fundamental ways in which a human life is unsatisfactory. And he points to that as the first noble truth. So we have to ask ourselves, what's noble about that, or what's ennobling about that? What is it that why is it that the Buddha starts there with them? And I would suggest that I learned something about this when I was in a chaplain, when I was offering spiritual care in the hospice, the hospital. I learned that sometimes, many times, actually, the kindest thing that you can say for someone or do for someone is to acknowledge their suffering. To begin just by acknowledging that there is suffering. There is a relief in that. There's a relief in being able to simply be present for that. And so the Buddha says later in this discourse, he says, so the noble truth of dukkha is to be understood. Dukkha is to be understood. And that might not be our first inclination when it comes to dukkha. Sometimes our first inclination when it comes to dukkha is to simply turn away, or to say that it's not really dukkha, or to try to replace it with some kind of pleasant thing. But the Buddha says no, that an understanding of dukkha is actually what's helpful. And he says very clearly here in the discourse, I read it to you specifically, the line here. He says, with the thought, quote, this is the noble truth of dukkha, quote, there arose in me, bhikkhus, vision, knowledge, insight, wisdom, light concerning things unknown before. With the thought that this noble truth, this dukkha, has to be understood, there arose in me vision, knowledge, insight, wisdom, light. And then when it had been understood, there arose in him vision, knowledge, insight, wisdom, and light. And for me, the most interesting part is that first step, the first of the three. Simply acknowledging that there is dukkha is itself a form of wisdom, is itself a valuable knowledge, a valuable insight on the path. In fact, I would say any step toward the understanding of dukkha, no matter how small, and whether it's our own dukkha or someone else's dukkha, is helpful, is wisdom, is progress on the path. And this aspect of things unknown before, this for me is one of the most fascinating. Things unknown before became apparent with this simple step of acknowledging the fact of dukkha in human life. And so for that, I want to tell you a little bit of a story that perhaps is a metaphor for the way in which the Dhamma as a whole is revealing to us things unknown before, even though there are things that are completely pervasive in our lives. So it was summertime in Japan, and I was there at a training monastery in Japan, and the as is typical of old traditional buildings there, the walls are made of paper, and the floors are made out of grass mats attached to some thin wood. So when it's cold out, it's cold inside, and when it's hot out, it's hot inside. So this was summertime in a part of Japan in a small fishing village called Obama, which is on the back side, what they call the back side of the main island. About an hour and 15 minutes or so northwest of Kyoto, on the strait between Japan and Korea. And so it's very muggy in the summertime. It's sort of like weather in the northeast of the United States, maybe very humid and hot. And so we were there, and by the grace of the folks who were the seniors at the monastery, we were all issued a fan, a little hand fan, something like this one. Although the one that we were issued was white at the edges, white plastic. This is also plastic, you might be able to see. White plastic on the edges, and in kind of an oval shape instead of a round shape like this, and blue in the center. And so we were all given a fan to help ourselves out during this hot weather. And there was going to be a big meeting because some of the monks had gone off to a meeting, an administrative meeting. And so we were all going to get together in the evening and talk about what they had learned at this meeting. And so we were going to this room off the kitchen to have this meeting that evening. And so I put my fan on my desk, on my little desk in my room. And when I put the fan down, I noticed for the first time that there was some information contained in this fan, because the face of the fan was blue on both sides, and it had these white dots on it. And when I put the fan down on the desk, I noticed, oh, these are not just random little white dots on the fan. This is actually a map of the night sky. This is a map of the constellations on the fan. So it was really funny to me because I thought, oh, here we are, and we have this concept of the night sky on our little fans. And instead of sitting outside underneath the night sky, we're going to go sit in this hot, stuffy room with each other and try to fan ourselves with this fan, with the concept of the sky on it. I thought, oh, that's just such a human thing that we do sometimes. Make do with the concept instead of the thing itself. But that's another tangent. Nonetheless, we went into the room and it was indeed hot and stuffy. And I was seated next to my fellow monk, Ryudo-san. Ryudo-san. His name means Dragon Way. And Ryudo-san had been a farmer before he was a monk, and he was sitting there next to me. And the whole meeting was taking place in Japanese, so I didn't understand anything. My Japanese is extremely poor. In Japanese, we say "skoshi dake," just a tiny, tiny bit. So I was just kind of tuned out, like blah, blah, blah. There's sound happening, and I'm sitting in my place melting, and not even using my fan because it was just too hot to even bother with that. But Ryudo-san was fanning himself next to me. And I looked over, and so I was watching him. I was watching his fan as he was fanning himself, Ryudo-san. And so there he is, and he's fanning himself. And then at one point, the fan caught the light, and it just turned all brilliant white. And it just startled me in a sense, not in a scary way, but like caught my eye. The whole fan turned white. So there wasn't blue, and there wasn't dots, and there weren't constellations, and there wasn't any of that. It was just a white light. And then flick, and then he flicks the fan again, and it goes back to being a fan with a map of the night sky on it. And then flick one more time, and again, white, this pure light. Not fan, not map, not blue, just pure light. And then flick one more time, back to being the constellations, or the concept of the constellations, you could say. And in that moment, it was so clear to me, like, oh my gosh, the nature, the fan is actually luminous in nature. It's not that it has a light bulb in it or anything like that, right? It's just that that's its nature. And there is a point at which that nature could come forth, and it completely blew away everything else. It completely disrupted the concept of fan and the concept of sky and stars and blue and all of those things. And its luminous nature came forth. And so I use this, the reason I'm telling you this very long story is because it's a metaphor in my mind for that, for the way that practice can show us something about the nature of our experience, which has always been there in a more subtle way. But until that moment of the conditions coming together, we can't actually see it. We haven't actually seen it. So the luminous nature of the mind is like this. So when the Buddha talks about light, that when he had this understanding suddenly that there is dukkha. This knowledge came to him, and there's a light. This is what I think of, this kind of this luminosity of the mind, and how that can become apparent to us through the practice and become more actionable, become more embodied, become more part of our expression and the next step on our path. So key to this question is, what helps us understand dukkha? What is it that helps us understand dukkha? So clearly, at a very simple level, we could say understanding dukkha internally is part of what we're doing when we sit in meditation. There are many, many different forms of meditation. And yet, at the most simple level, we could say just learning to be present with the mind and body of this moment, which is sooner or later expressing dukkha, experiencing dukkha, showing us dukkha. That is something that we can learn how to do moment by moment on the cushion. Just to learn to be present with that, we just become familiar with our capacity to be with what is, in terms of the dukkha of a human life. In our inner world, particularly, in our inner world. And we can become more familiar, more intimate with the process nature of it also. So seeing suffering after suffering after suffering, that's not the whole path. There is something about this mechanism that the Buddha is also pointing to. And then there's dukkha externally. So sometimes it's hard for us to look at dukkha internally. Sometimes it's very difficult to actually turn toward that. So one way that we can start to understand dukkha is to look at it externally. So there are many different examples of this. Some people feel the pain and suffering of animals, particularly now as the climate is shifting and many animals are losing their habitats, for example. Or we can actually begin to understand the dukkha of others, other human beings. COVID is bringing this very closely, bringing this very close to home, I think, for all of us. The matter of death, right here, every day, present for all of us. Or the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, I've been involved with that for years. And many of us here, in fact, I think all of us who are here at the monastery, all the nuns who are here at the monastery now have been involved in this movement. Again, hearing the cries of the dukkha and trying to learn something about, trying to understand more about how that arises and what we can do to give service to make sure that those voices are heard and responded to. And this kind of finding dukkha in our external world is a way that we can begin to build compassion. And to build compassion born of the understanding that while each life is completely unique and completely individual, there are also universal principles that are at work within our lives. Both things are true. So that we can begin to have open hearts and hearts and more understanding of how dukkha is expressing itself in others. And just being of service can stretch us beyond our self-interest. Sometimes I like to tell the story also related to my days in hospice, spiritual care, of going and attending to a woman who was very close to death. She's a woman of the Jewish tradition spiritually, and she was not somebody that I had been seeing regularly. But on my last day, actually, as a hospice chaplain, I went to go see her because we'd gotten word from her nurses that she was very close to dying and she would appreciate somebody coming and being with her and perhaps offering some kind of a blessing. And so I offered to go because my colleague who had been seeing her regularly was homesick that day. And I walked into the room with this woman, and and at first I wasn't sure if she was even alive still because the room was so quiet. And she was lying on a couch actually in her room. This was the kind of place where they really wanted the residents to be comfortable. Lying there on the couch, and I got very close in order to see if I could feel her breathing. And so as I got closer, she woke up a little bit and she noticed that I was there. And she said to me, "Why here? Why here?" She was asking me why I was there. And I started to say something about being a chaplain and introduce myself, but she said, "No, why here? Why here?" And so I understood that she wasn't in the place of wanting a conversation, wasn't going to be able to engage in any kind of deep conversation, but there was this wanting to connect nonetheless. And so I said very simply, "I came to give you a blessing." And she said, "Oh, blessings." And she took both of my hands and she I said, "Yes, blessings." And then I lowered my head for a moment to try to think about what I would say, because goodness knows that the Jewish tradition is probably the spiritual tradition about which I know the least, one of the traditions about which I know the least. So I was sort of gathering my thoughts for a moment and holding her hand. And she leaned over to me and she said, "Blessings." And I said, "Yes, blessings." And then she said, "Blessings." And I said, "Yes, blessings." And then blessings, blessings. And she started leaning toward me and holding my hands tighter and tighter. And she was blessing, blessings, 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 blessings. And I realized, oh my goodness, this woman is dying and she's blessing me, giving this gift. And I felt in that moment so clear that that is why we do this. That's why we come to the bedside of someone who's dying, because it's one of the most human things we can do. And just being there for each other and holding each other's hands was a blessing for both of us. So even in the midst of whatever dukkha she's experiencing, in what might be the last day of her life, this woman had the generosity of heart and the understanding that in our intimacy with the dukkha of death, we could actually experience something beyond just this inner world. We could experience this intimacy between us and this and understand dukkha in a different way. So I think that there are ways in which we can practice with this understanding of dukkha that, as the Buddha said, brings a beautiful light and a wisdom. And then just to go on, so we're just on the first noble truth. So the second noble truth is, as many of you probably know, that craving is the cause of dukkha. Craving. or tanha, thirst. Thirst is the sort of literal translation of it. Craving. And craving for what in particular? Craving for sense pleasures, existence, or non-existence, or sometimes translated as annihilation. So I think the way that it's translated in our version here in the book. So if I hear those three things, I think, oh yes, this relates again directly to where the Buddha started. It's this kind of craving for these three things that drives that kind of behavior. Right? Indulgence or the mortification driven is underpinned by this kind of deep craving. And so it's very consistent with where he starts. That middle way is actually the direction in which we need to go in order to relinquish this craving, which is what he says must be done with craving, that it must be abandoned, must be relinquished. And then he says cessation. So dukkha, the truth, there's the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha. So dukkha can come to an end. And come to an end. And again, this is where we see the Buddha really emphasizing the efficacy of action. The efficacy, the point that what we do, the choices we make, can put us on a path of more and more and more dukkha, or put us on a path of liberation, freedom, and peace, wisdom. And that path is described as, in the Fourth Noble Truth, as the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is the path that leads to the cessation. And the path, the Noble Eightfold Path, is to be cultivated, be developed. So this, I believe, is a teaching of patience. It takes time. Yes, there are great leaps in insight. There are great leaps in our practice sometimes. But even those great leaps are preceded by innumerable tiny, tiny steps in the right direction. Tiny steps. So really taking the time, cultivate the path, hanging in there for ourselves, being willing to hang in there for ourselves. And one tool in particular for that part of the path, I will say, that the Buddha talks about in other discourses, not particularly in this discourse, but in the other discourses, he says, recall the good that is occurring from your practice. Call the good that you're doing by leading an ethical life, by simply upholding the 5 precepts, or by sitting in meditation and investigating dukkha, or by offering the generosity of your time or your financial resources, or any number of other ways you can be cultivating your path. Really, really remind yourself over and over again, because this is what will help you. This is what will support you to go all the way. Go all the way. So really allow the path, as I said earlier, to be a source of joy, a source of joy in your life. And in fact, one way that you might start with this is also to recall the good of the practice of others, of people with whom you've been in contact, or the practice of others, for example, in texts that you might read from teachers centuries ago, or the discourses of the Buddha. All of these things are ways that you can bring joy into your life. Celebrating the good, the goodness of practice in the world, the goodness of the Dhamma in the world. So then the Buddha declares his absolute certainty about these. And he says, so long as his knowledge and vision of reality regarding these Four Noble Truths in their 3 phases and 12 aspects was not fully clear, I did not declare the realization of perfect enlightenment. But when that knowledge and vision was perfectly clear, I declared to the world of devas and seekers and human beings that I understood incomparable perfect enlightenment. So again, the Buddha pointing out the process nature of the path and the fact that even for him there was a cultivation that had to occur. So why would it not be that way for us? And then there is a part which is recalling the statement of Venerable Kondanya. So Kondanya was one of these 5 companions who had been practicing with the Buddha. And in that moment, it says in the sutta, this immaculate vision of the Dhamma appeared to the Venerable Kondanya, and he knew, quote, everything that has the nature to arise has the nature to cease. Everything that is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. So this was Kondanya's inner understanding of what the Buddha had just said by describing the Four Noble Truths. And I have to say, sometimes that sounds very simple. Sounds very straightforward. Everything that is of the nature to arise is of the nature to cease. And yet, we live at war with that reality. We live in a state of constant resistance to that reality. Even in simple ways, even in funny ways. I'll give you a short story about that as well. So when I was in the chaplaincy training in the hospital, we were a cohort of 7. And there was a young woman named Kelly, who was an Episcopalian deacon, I believe. And she was in the group at a time when I had been asked to say a little bit of something about Buddhism. And so I expressed this, that we have a tremendous amount of resistance to the fact that things are impermanent, things are ceasing all the time. And she came up to me afterward and she said, you know, I don't know that I'm really resisting that. I can't think of a time when I really resisted that the fact that things are changing. And I said, well, you don't have to believe it. You can, just think about it. See if it's true for you. And if it's not true for you, that's okay too. And then Kelly came up to me about a week later and she said to me, wow, you know what happened? I realized that I am resisting, because every morning I would get up for this past week. It had been a very rainy week. And she said, every morning for this past week, I would get up and I would look at the weather forecast, and the weather forecast was for rain. But I would look outside my window and it was sunny. And so I would think to myself, oh, I'm not going to bring my umbrella because it's sunny right now and it'll still be sunny later. And then sure enough, it would rain and she would get all wet. And she would be frustrated because she knew that it was going to change, that the forecast, the prediction was that it was going to change. And yet she couldn't actually just accept that and take her umbrella with her every day. And the funniest part of this story was that Kelly didn't know that I had done the same thing when I was in college. I had come across exactly the same phenomena when I was in college in Miami, where in the summer especially it tends to rain every afternoon, even though the mornings are sunny and clear. So we had a good laugh about it. But we resist the fact in so many ways, gross and subtle. Nonetheless, the devas, having seen that this first passing on of the Dhamma has occurred. So the Buddha has expressed the middle way, the Noble Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, and Kondanya has understood something about it. And the devas start celebrating. Now, whether you believe in actual devas, like heavenly beings, celestial beings, or not, the implication here is that it's something to celebrate. This moment in which the Dhamma actually comes into the world and begins to be something that can be passed on and be described so that beings can also awaken just as the Buddha did. It's a beautiful moment. It's a beautiful moment. And so the devas celebrate, and I celebrate, and we're still celebrating these many thousands of years later, that moment in which Kondanya understood. And so the Buddha affirms Kondanya's understanding. He says, Kondanya has indeed understood, has understood. And so there, from that time forward, the Venerable Kondanya became known as Anya Kondanya. Anya Kondanya, one who understands, Kondanya who understands. And one thing I'd like to say about that is, please note that Kondanya was a layperson. At that time, he was a seeker. He was somebody who had been practicing very hard, but he was a layperson. There wasn't an ordained Sangha of the Buddha at that time yet. So please remember, all of you who are living lay lives, that even in the midst of a life of dukkha, there is the path to liberation. That is ultimately, I want to say, the message of this discourse. Even amidst a life which is pervaded by suffering, there is a path to liberation. Whether you're living a lay life or you're living a life as a monastic, if you put in the effort, practice to understand these principles, to see them at work in your mind, in your life, that effort will have an effect. It will lead you in the direction of absolute freedom. So I hope that this has been helpful, and that you also take the opportunity to celebrate the presence of the Dhamma in the world, just as we are doing now during Vasa. So at this point, we'll stop the recording, and we have about 5 minutes or so for some question and answer.